My name is Elena Cross, Director of Revenue Compliance at ArcLight Systems, a mid-sized enterprise software company that likes to call itself aggressively growth-focused. I built the compliance infrastructure that monitors SLA performance across more than $200 million in enterprise contracts. Officially, I audit numbers and publish reports. Unofficially, I prevent expensive promises from detonating when uptime slips and penalty clauses wake up. Grant Holloway, our VP of Enterprise Operations, closes big deals fast and celebrates faster. I read the fine print he skims. He calls that negativity. I call it math. He'd been waiting for the right moment to cut me out of the picture. And apparently, quarter-end pressure gave him one. If this sounds familiar, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I like knowing who's sharing this moment with me, and if you choose to subscribe, you're not just following a story, you're also helping spread the message that doing the right thing quietly still matters. At 11 o'clock on a Tuesday, HR invited me to a meeting, not in a private office, in the glass conference room planted in the middle of the floor, transparent walls. Maximum visibility. Subtlety was not the goal. Grant was already seated, composed, hands folded like this was routine. HR slid a printed copy of my job description across the table. "You've been stepping outside your responsibilities," she said evenly. "Just do your job." There it was. Not feedback. A boundary. I kept my expression neutral. "So, you want me to stop intervening in contract risk? We want clarity of scope," she replied. Grant added, almost gently, "We need you focused." Focused. As if preventing seven-figure penalties was a distraction. I nodded once. Calm, controlled, understood. I'll stick to my job description. The meeting ended with polite smiles and corporate stillness. I walked back to my desk under the quiet awareness of people pretending not to watch. Then I opened the compliance dashboard I designed 3 years ago, the one with manual SLA adjustment controls I'd used to keep borderline outages from triggering automatic breach notices. One by one, I turned them off. No announcement, no protest, just clarity of scope. Before we go any further, allow me to pause for a moment. What you're listening to is a fictional story, aided by artificial intelligence to make it sharper and more vivid. I hope it leaves a lasting impression and provides you with an enjoyable experience. But if you are listening after a long, tiring day filled with personal difficulties, please take care of yourself first. 2 days after HR told me to stay in my lane, the first test arrived right on schedule, at 8:43 that morning. Our primary data cluster stalled. Total downtime, 2.4 hours. Not catastrophic, not dramatic, just long enough to matter. Within minutes, engineering pinged me on Slack. "Can you smooth the reporting window?" It barely crossed the threshold. I read the message twice before answering. "Reporting is automated. I only audit." There was a pause in the thread. Then, a few typing bubbles that disappeared. No one pushed further. They knew the manual adjustments were gone. At 9:15, the compliance system I built 3 years ago did exactly what it was designed to do. It calculated cumulative uptime against contractual thresholds and generated an automatic SLA breach notice to our largest enterprise client. The email went out clean, time-stamped, and documented. My phone rang 30 seconds later. "Grant, pull that notice," he said. "Skipping hello. It's part of compliance protocol," I replied calmly. "You've overridden before." That was outside my documented scope. Silence. Controlled breathing on the other end. What Grant forgot was that every breach notice automatically copied the CFO. That transparency rule had been my idea after a previous audit scare. No selective reporting. No quiet edits. By 10:30, the client responded formally. They were invoking the service credit clause outlined in Appendix D. $780,000. The first breach wasn't loud. It was procedural. And that was the problem. By the end of the first breach, the tension across the floor had shifted from denial to damage control. $780,000 was no longer theoretical. It was real, documented, and already visible to finance, and Grant was scrambling. He went to IT first. The request was dressed up as a data reconciliation, but everyone understood what it meant: adjust the numbers, reframe the window, find flexibility in the calculation. IT didn't move. The audit trail had locked the moment the breach notice went out. Every metric pull, every adjustment, every override was timestamped and archived. That safeguard existed because I built it that way. No silent revisions. No historical edits without leaving fingerprints. When that route failed, Grant shifted tactics. In the emergency leadership call, he said it clearly. Elena refused to collaborate. We could have mitigated this. I didn't argue. I simply forwarded the HR directive into the meeting thread. You've been stepping outside your responsibilities. Just do your job. No commentary, just their words. The silence that followed was different from the usual corporate pause. It wasn't confusion, it was recognition. But pressure doesn't dissipate, it compounds. Our second largest enterprise client, monitoring the public SLA dashboard we provide for transparency, began reviewing their own performance metrics. They weren't reacting to rumor, they were reacting to data, and they saw the same cumulative uptime pattern approaching their contractual threshold. A formal inquiry landed in our inbox: confirmation requested on rolling SLA exposure. Finance ran projections. If the second client invoked their service credit clause, the additional liability would reach $320,000, $780,000 plus $320,000. Total exposure before the day was over $1.1 million. No one was yelling. That was the unsettling part. It wasn't chaos. It was arithmetic tightening around us, one documented breach at a time. By the start of the second day, the mood wasn't panic, it was containment. That's how companies like ours respond when numbers start bleeding, not with sirens, but with meetings. Two of our largest enterprise clients formally requested a full SLA audit and historical recalculation. Not just confirmation of the recent outage. They wanted rolling averages, prior incidents, reporting logic, and documentation of adjustment protocols. In other words, they wanted to see how the machine actually worked. And the machine was mine. Grant cornered me outside a conference room before the next leadership call. His voice was low, almost reasonable. Be a team player, he said. We need flexibility right now. I held his gaze. Update my scope in writing. He exhaled sharply. This isn't the time to be technical. This is exactly the time to be technical. He didn't respond, because putting it in writing meant accountability. And accountability was the one clause he never liked signing. So nothing was updated. The system continued doing what it was built to do. Every downtime minute fed into the rolling calculation. Every threshold crossing generated documentation. Every documented breach notified the client and copied finance. No edits, no smoothing, no heroics. Inside the executive call, tension stayed controlled but visible. Finance presented cumulative exposure. Legal asked about disclosure language. Sales asked about relationship management. No one asked me to override the system again. They asked me to clarify assumptions, which was corporate for "please help us." I clarified nothing beyond the data. By midday, recalculations from the second client confirmed additional service credits. The numbers climbed steadily. Not dramatically, just relentlessly. $780,000 from the first client, $320,000 from the second. Additional minor exposure from recalculated historical windows. Total potential liability crossed $1.9 million. No shouting, no slammed doors, just spreadsheets tightening. Then the escalation arrived. One of the clients sent a formal notice unless governance controls were strengthened and named accountability established. They would pause a planned $14 million expansion scheduled for the next quarter. That wasn't a penalty, that was leverage. And suddenly, the cost wasn't just service credits, it was trust, compounding. By the third day, no one pretended this was a misunderstanding anymore. The data had momentum, and momentum doesn't care about ego. The rolling 30-day SLA average crossed the contractual threshold just after another minor outage pushed the percentage below the safe margin. It wasn't dramatic. No catastrophic crash. Just accumulated minutes finally tipping the scale. The system calculated. The clause triggered. Automatic penalty. Finance recalculated exposure across all affected contracts, including historical adjustments now formally requested by clients. When the updated summary circulated internally, the number no longer started with a 7 or a 1. It was $2.3 million in 72 hours. Not projected. Documented. The executive meeting that followed was packed. Legal, finance, operations, HR. Grant stood at the head of the table, red but composed enough to stay loud. She weaponized compliance. He said, she knew exactly what would happen. I didn't interrupt him. I waited. When the room shifted toward me, I kept my voice steady. I followed HR's instruction. That was it. No accusation, no tone, just a fact. HR looked uncomfortable. Grant looked betrayed, which would have been impressive if he hadn't orchestrated the directive himself. He tried again. You removed the manual adjustments. They were outside my documented scope. The CFO spoke next, and his voice was different. Not angry. Calculating. Can we reverse any of this? Number legal answered before I could. The disclosures are contractual. The audit trail is intact. That was the moment the temperature changed. Not because of yelling, because concealment was no longer an option. The CFO escalated the summary directly to the board. He didn't have a choice. Material financial exposure requires disclosure. Once the board packet was updated, it moved beyond Grant's narrative control. By the time the board joined the follow-up call, the story had narrowed to essentials contract terms, reporting integrity, governance oversight. No one asked why I hadn't intervened. They asked who approved the risk, and then the chairwoman said the sentence that ended the argument. We need an immediate governance review. No drama, no applause, just accountability. Finally formalized. If you believe I was right to follow the written directive, remove the manual overrides, and let the compliance system run exactly as designed. Leave a 1 in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think, because accountability only holds when people are willing to stand behind it. The boardroom felt colder than the executive meetings, not because of the air conditioning, but because performance was no longer useful there. This wasn't about saving face, it was about tracing cause. The chair opened with a direct question. Who removed the manual overrides? Every eye shifted toward me. I did. I answered. They were outside my job description. No defensiveness, no apology, just alignment. Another board member leaned forward. Explain? So I did. I walked them through the sequence. Not emotionally, but structurally. First, the HR directive instructing me to stay within scope. Then, the explicit scope restriction limiting my role to audit and reporting. After that, the documented warnings I had sent over the previous 2 quarters regarding SLA risk exposure in enterprise contracts. Finally, the signed agreements themselves, each containing penalty clauses tied to rolling uptime averages. I didn't embellish. I projected the timeline on the screen. Dates, emails, contract excerpts, audit logs showing when manual adjustments had historically been applied and when they were disabled. This system, I said evenly, was designed for transparency when I was instructed to stop intervening. The system functioned without intervention. The CFO turned slowly toward Grant. Did you read Appendix D? Appendix D was the penalty structure, service credits, escalation triggers, disclosure obligations. Grant opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. No denial, no confirmation, just silence that said enough. Legal added that once the breach notices were sent and acknowledged, reversal would have constituted disclosure manipulation. That word landed heavier than any accusation. The board wasn't interested in personality conflicts. They were interested in governance breakdown. Why were manual overrides dependent on one individual? Why were high-risk contracts approved without compliance sign-off? Why did HR restrict risk oversight during quarter-end pressure? The exposure wasn't just financial anymore. It was procedural. By the end of the session, the chair summarized calmly. This requires an independent review. An internal audit was formally initiated to examine contract oversight, approval processes, and reporting controls. For the first time since this began, the spotlight wasn't on me. It was on the system that tried to sideline me. The audit may have shifted the spotlight, but it didn't neutralize Grant. If anything, it sharpened him. Exposure breeds retaliation in people who mistake scrutiny for betrayal. 2 days after the board initiated the governance review, I received a calendar invite from HR titled Performance Alignment. That phrasing was deliberate, not discipline, alignment. Inside the meeting, Grant was already seated. HR began carefully. There have been concerns regarding collaboration and partnership. Grant took over. You've become non-collaborative. There's been a lack of partnership during a critical period. There it was. The counterattack. I listened without interrupting. Then I responded the only way that mattered. Please provide all allegations in writing, specific dates, specific requests, and confirmation that those requests were within my documented scope. HR hesitated. Grant didn't. This isn't about technicalities. He said, it's about teamwork. No, I replied evenly. It's about documented responsibility. They didn't have documentation. They had frustration. Within hours, I received a draft performance improvement plan labeling me non-collaborative and resistant to executive direction. I replied requesting clarification on which policy I violated. I copied legal, calmly. That was when the tension shifted again. Internal audit had begun reviewing contract communications related to recent enterprise deals. What they found wasn't subtle. An email from Grant to sales leadership surfaced in the document request log, close first. We'll fix SLA later. The sentence was short. Casual, damaging. Because fix later meant override later, adjust later, mitigate exposure later. Except the overrides were gone. The audit team requested clarification on whether compliance had been formally consulted prior to deal execution. It hadn't. By the end of the week, legal joined the HR follow-up meeting. Not as observers, as participants. One of the attorneys spoke plainly. If we proceed with disciplinary action against Elena, while contract oversight is under investigation, we increase liability. That wasn't advice. It was a warning. Scapegoating during a documented governance review doesn't look strategic. It looks retaliatory. Grant said very little after that. The PIP didn't disappear, but it stalled. And for the first time, retaliation wasn't automatic. It was risky. Retaliation stalled. But something else gathered momentum outside our walls. The largest enterprise client formally initiated a vendor risk review. That phrase sounds procedural. It isn't. It's corporate leverage with documentation. The notice arrived through legal channels, not account management. They were not interested in apologies. They were requesting structure. Their demands were explicit. Named contract accountability for every enterprise agreement. Clear escalation transparency with documented response timelines. Quarterly compliance audits conducted with client visibility. No more informal adjustments. No more we'll handle it internally. The shift was immediate. Sales stopped forecasting aggressively because new enterprise contracts required additional review layers. Legal slowed approvals pending audit findings. Finance flagged exposure in earnings guidance. The enterprise pipeline, which had been sprinting toward quarterly targets, froze in place. Grant felt it first. His authority to sign new enterprise contracts was temporarily suspended, pending oversight clarification. Officially, it was described as process alignment. Unofficially, it was containment. He attempted to frame it as collaborative reform. We're strengthening governance, he said in an internal memo. But governance doesn't strengthen selectively. It standardizes power. For years, Grant had operated in gray space close deals. Adjust later, manage optics. Now every adjustment required documentation. Every deviation required cross-functional approval. Every high-risk clause required compliance review before execution, which meant me. I wasn't promoted. I wasn't celebrated. But my function became unavoidable. The client's review team requested live walkthroughs of our SLA monitoring architecture. I presented the system as it existed, automated, transparent, audit-locked, no theatrics, just process. The more structured the conversation became, the less space there was for narrative manipulation. Then the final ripple reached HR. During the vendor risk documentation exchange, the client requested internal policy artifacts demonstrating risk governance alignment. That included the recent scope restriction directive issued to me. HR was asked to produce justification for limiting compliance intervention during quarter-end contract execution. That question carried weight, because if governance was deliberately narrowed while risk expanded, the exposure wasn't operational, it was cultural, and for the first time since this began, the pressure wasn't pressing down on me, it was pressing upward. Power doesn't collapse in a dramatic moment, it erodes under documentation. The internal audit findings were delivered in a controlled executive session. No raised voices, no moral speeches, just findings: failure to review penalty clauses prior to contract execution, documented encouragement to defer SLA concerns, insufficient governance oversight. The language was clinical. The impact was not. Grant was placed on administrative suspension pending final board review. Within a week, the announcement followed termination for negligent governance and breach of oversight protocol. The memo avoided theatrics. It emphasized organizational realignment. Everyone understood what that meant. HR wasn't untouched either. The directive limiting my scope during quarter end was cited in the governance review. The head of HR was reassigned to a non-operational role while policy frameworks were evaluated. No public apology, just quiet repositioning. Justice in corporations rarely looks emotional. It looks procedural. A week later, the board requested a private meeting with me. The tone was markedly different from earlier sessions. "We need to rebuild the compliance framework," the chairwoman said. From first principles, they wanted centralized contract review authority, automated SLA transparency, and defined escalation ownership before deal execution. They wanted the guardrails formalized, not optional. I listened carefully. Then I responded just as carefully. "I'll agree to lead the restructuring under 2 conditions." I said, "First, independent compliance authority not subject to sales or operations override. Second, no manual adjustments to SLA reporting without written board approval." Silence followed, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was evaluative. The CFO nodded first. Legal agreed immediately. The chairwoman confirmed it formally. Approved. For the first time in my tenure. Compliance wasn't an advisory function. It was structural authority. And yet, power shifting internally wasn't the only development. That same week, I received a call from a competitor in our sector. They had been watching the vendor risk review publicly disclosed by our client. They didn't ask about controversy. They asked about systems. The offer that followed was direct a compensation package 70% higher than my current salary. Plus, equity participation tied to governance performance. Justice had unfolded, but leverage had expanded. In the end, the real consequence wasn't the money. It was clarity. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't hack a system or manipulate numbers. I didn't leak documents or stage a rebellion. I stopped donating invisible labor. That was it, for years. I had quietly absorbed risk on behalf of people who confused speed with strategy. I adjusted, smoothed, buffered, and prevented exposure before it reached daylight. When HR told me to just do your job, I did exactly that. I removed the unofficial protections and allowed the formal system to function without interference. 3 days. $2.3 million. Not because I broke something, because I stopped fixing what wasn't mine to fix. Grant once told me, "Know your place." At the time, it was meant as a warning, a reminder not to challenge the hierarchy. What he didn't understand was that I did know my place. My place was in governance, in documentation, in contracts that meant what they said. When I confined myself to that role, The system exposed everything else. That's the part people miss about accountability. It doesn't require noise. It requires alignment. I didn't win by shouting louder. I won by standing still. And when the structure finally held, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like equilibrium restored. For a long time, I believed being valuable meant being indispensable, stepping in early, fixing quietly, absorbing pressure so others could look composed. But value without boundaries turns into expectation, and expectation without recognition turns into exploitation. The moment I stopped working outside my defined role, the system revealed who had been depending on invisible labor to stay afloat. There's a practical lesson in that. Document your work. Understand your contracts. Know exactly what you are responsible for and what you're not. There's also an emotional one. Calm doesn't mean weakness. Silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes the strongest move is simply refusing to carry what isn't yours. If you were in my position, would you have kept protecting the system, or would you have stepped back and let the structure speak for itself? I'd genuinely like to know, where are you listening from right now? And if this story resonates, consider subscribing. A simple subscribe, like, or share might help someone else realize they don't have to shrink to survive. Your support doesn't just grow a channel, it spreads a reminder that accountability matters. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.